Hello guys. If you're new to my channel, please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment letting me know how you felt about today's story. You can also suggest what kind of stories you'd like to see next on the channel. Now, let's get started with today's story. They used my retirement money to build their dream kitchen, then told me to eat in the basement. Margaret Ellis had always believed that love looked like sacrifice. Not the dramatic kind people post about online. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts. Real love, the kind she understood after 42 years of marriage and raising 2 children, looked quieter than that. It looked like staying up until 2:00 a.m. sewing Halloween costumes because money was tight. It looked like eating canned soup for a week, so your son could go on the school trip without feeling embarrassed. It looked like working overtime at the hospital for 19 straight days after your husband lost his job in 1993. And most of all, it looked like saying yes when your family needed you. Even when saying yes cost you pieces of yourself. At 68 years old, Margaret didn't think there was much left in life that could truly surprise her. Then one Tuesday afternoon, standing alone in the basement of the house she had helped pay for, holding a paper plate with cold leftover pasta on it, while laughter echoed upstairs from a dining room she was no longer welcome to sit in, she realized she had been wrong. Her husband Daniel died in October. Suddenly, a stroke. 1 minute he was sitting in his recliner arguing with the television about football like he had every Sunday for decades. The next minute, he was gone. People always talk about grief like it arrives all at once, like a thunderstorm crashing through your life. But for Margaret, grief arrived like silence. The silence of only one coffee mug coming out in the morning. The silence of one side of the bed staying perfectly untouched. The silence of grocery shopping alone after 42 years of reaching automatically for Daniel's favorite cereal. That was the worst part. Not the funeral. Not the paperwork, the silence. Her son, Brian, started calling more often after the funeral. At first, she thought it was sweet. Mom, you doing okay? Mom, have you eaten today? Mom, maybe you shouldn't be alone right now. Brian lived about 45 minutes away in Louisville with his wife, Vanessa, and their 2 daughters, Ava and Sophie. Margaret loved those girls more than life itself. And when Brian suggested she move in with them, temporarily, she cried from relief. You shouldn't be by yourself after everything, Brian told her gently. We've got plenty of room. Vanessa agreed immediately. Honestly, Margaret, the girls would love having Grandma here. Looking back now, Margaret realized something important. Vanessa always sounded most enthusiastic when discussing what Margaret could do for the household. At the time, she missed that completely. Because grief makes you vulnerable in ways people don't talk about enough. When you lose the person who anchored your whole life, you become desperate to belong somewhere again. So Margaret sold the house, not because she wanted to, because it felt impossible living there without Daniel. Every room held memories sharp enough to cut her open. The kitchen, where they danced barefoot every New Year's Eve. The garage where Daniel taught Brian how to change a tire. The back porch where they drank coffee together every morning for nearly 4 decades. She couldn't breathe there anymore. So when Brian mentioned that their house needed renovations and joked that your retirement money could probably build us the kitchen Vanessa's always dreamed about, Margaret laughed too. At first. Then Brian brought it up again, more seriously. Mom, think about it, he said over dinner one night. Instead of paying for some tiny condo somewhere, you could invest in family. Vanessa leaned forward immediately. And you'd have your own beautiful space here. We could renovate the basement too. A little private suite just for you, Brian smiled. We'd all be together. That word gets older women every time, especially lonely ones. Margaret had around $210,000 from selling the house, plus retirement savings Daniel had carefully built over decades. Not rich, but enough to live comfortably if she was careful. Enough for independence, enough for freedom, Enough if she had protected it. Instead, she handed over $120,000 to Brian and Vanessa for the renovations, for family, for togetherness. Vanessa hugged her so tightly Margaret could barely breathe. "Oh my God, Margaret," she whispered emotionally. "This changes everything." That should have been the first warning. Not "this helps," not "thank you." This changes everything. Because it did, just not for Margaret. The renovation lasted 6 months. 6 exhausting, noisy, chaotic months. Margaret stayed in the basement during construction while Vanessa obsessed over every tiny detail upstairs. Marble countertops, imported tile, custom cabinets, a double oven, a wine refrigerator. Margaret listened patiently while Vanessa spent hours explaining backsplash colors and cabinet finishes like they were matters of national importance. "It has to feel luxurious," Vanessa kept saying. Luxurious. Margaret noticed nobody used that word about the basement suite they'd promised her. The basement got basic carpeting, a small bathroom, cheap paint. No windows except one tiny rectangle near the ceiling. "It's cozy," Brian said proudly during the final walkthrough. Margaret smiled anyway, because she had started noticing something uncomfortable about herself. She was becoming grateful for crumbs, grateful for being included at all. That happens slowly. You don't notice it immediately. One day you're an equal member of the family. The next, you're apologizing for taking up space in a house you helped finance. The kitchen reveal became practically a religious event in Vanessa's world. She posted photos online constantly. Dream kitchen finally complete. Manifestation works. So grateful for this beautiful blessing. Margaret appeared in none of the pictures, not one. Even though her money had paid for nearly all of it. The first dinner they hosted after the renovation was enormous. Friends, neighbors, Vanessa's sisters, co-workers. Everyone gathered around the massive marble island, admiring the kitchen Margaret had funded. Vanessa floated around glowing with pride, while Brian grilled steaks outside. Margaret cooked almost every side dish herself. Nobody mentioned that either. At one point, Margaret overheard Vanessa giving someone a tour. "And this is the kitchen renovation we saved forever for," Vanessa said proudly. Saved. Margaret stood silently beside the sink holding a bowl of mashed potatoes while something cold settled quietly into her chest. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. The kind that arrives before heartbreak fully forms. The changes after the renovation were subtle at first. That's how disrespect usually begins. Not loudly, quietly, gradually. Like water rising around your ankles. Vanessa started correcting little things. "Margaret, we don't use those pans on the new stove. Margaret, can you wipe fingerprints off the refrigerator? Margaret, the girls really need healthier snacks than that." Then came the rules. "Please don't eat in the living room. Please don't leave lights on downstairs. Please text before inviting anyone over. Please don't rearrange the pantry. Please keep basement laundry separate from upstairs laundry." Basement laundry. Margaret noticed the wording immediately. Not family laundry, basement laundry. The house slowly became divided into territories. Upstairs belonged to Brian and Vanessa. Downstairs belonged to Margaret. Even meals changed. At first, they all ate together regularly. Then Brian started working later. Then the girls had activities. Then Vanessa began saying things like, "Oh, don't wait for us." Margaret found herself eating alone more and more often. Usually downstairs. Sometimes while hearing laughter upstairs through the ceiling vents. There is a particular loneliness to hearing people enjoy life one floor above you while pretending you don't notice you weren't included. It changes you. Still, Margaret kept giving. Because older women are taught that love means endurance. When Ava got sick, Margaret stayed awake all night beside her bed. When Sophie needed help with school projects, Margaret handled them patiently for hours. When Vanessa got overwhelmed, Margaret cleaned the kitchen without being asked. When Brian forgot birthdays, Margaret bought gifts. When everyone else got busy, Margaret became useful. That was her role now. Useful, not cherished, not respected. Useful. And usefulness can become a trap if you aren't careful. Because the more reliable you become, the less people notice your humanity. You stop being a person. You become infrastructure. The breaking point came on Easter Sunday. Ironically, a holiday about resurrection, about rising again. Margaret woke up at 5:30 a.m. to start cooking. Ham, scalloped potatoes, homemade rolls. Deviled eggs, green beans, 3 pies. She worked for 7 straight hours. Vanessa spent most of the morning upstairs, getting ready and occasionally appearing in the kitchen to criticize presentation details. Can you make the carrots look a little more elegant? Elegant carrots. Margaret nearly laughed. By 2:00 p.m., guests started arriving. Vanessa's family first, then neighbors, then Brian's coworkers. The house filled with noise and perfume and expensive clothes and loud conversation. Margaret stayed mostly in the kitchen preparing serving trays. Nobody explicitly asked her to. But somehow she had become responsible for everything behind the scenes. At one point, she caught sight of herself in the microwave reflection. Gray hair pulled back hastily, flour on her sweater. Tired eyes. She looked less like family and more like hired help. The realization hit hard enough to make her grip the counter. Still, she said nothing, because saying nothing had become a habit. Dinner was finally ready around 4:30. The dining room table looked beautiful. Vanessa had gone all out. Gold napkin rings, fresh flowers, crystal glasses, place cards, place cards. Margaret noticed immediately there wasn't one of them. At first, she assumed it was a mistake. Then Vanessa smiled brightly and said the sentence Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. Oh, Margaret, we figured you'd probably be more comfortable eating downstairs while everyone gets settled up here. It's pretty crowded. Comfortable downstairs, in the basement, with a paper plate. While 20 people sat upstairs eating food she had cooked in a kitchen she had paid for. Margaret stared at her. Brian avoided eye contact completely. That hurt worse. Because silence from your child feels different than cruelty from anyone else. Silence from your child feels like abandonment. Vanessa kept talking casually, completely unaware she was detonating something irreversible. We'll bring leftovers down later. Leftovers. Margaret looked around the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody said, that's ridiculous, Margaret belongs here. Nobody moved to make space. Nobody even looked uncomfortable enough. And in that exact moment, Margaret understood something devastating. This arrangement had become normal to them. That was the worst part, not the insult itself, the normalization of it. She took the paper plate, smiled politely, walked downstairs, closed the basement door behind her, and cried harder than she had at Daniel's funeral, because grief for the dead is simpler than grief for the living. Daniel had loved her. That had never been in question. But sitting alone in that basement on Easter Sunday, hearing muffled laughter upstairs while staring at cold ham on a paper plate, Margaret realized the people she had sacrificed everything for no longer saw her as family. Just convenient, useful, contained. She sat there for almost an hour, then something inside her changed, quietly, completely. She stopped crying, wiped her face, and looked around the basement carefully. The cheap furniture, the dim lighting, the tiny window, the life she had accepted because she was afraid of being alone. And suddenly, being alone didn't seem frightening anymore. What frightened her was staying. Around 8:00 p.m., Margaret walked upstairs. Nobody noticed immediately. That hurt too. The party continued around her like she was invisible. Vanessa was laughing loudly near the kitchen island. Brian was watching basketball with friends. Children ran through the hallway screaming. Margaret walked calmly to the pantry, took her purse, grabbed her car keys, then she looked directly at Brian. Can I speak to you for a minute? Something in her tone made him follow immediately. They stepped into the laundry room. Margaret closed the door. Then she said the hardest sentence of her life. I think it's time I leave. Brian blinked rapidly. What? I'm moving out. Mom, don't be dramatic. No, she interrupted softly. Don't do that. Don't reduce this to me being emotional. Brian looked uncomfortable immediately. I I didn't know Vanessa said that to you. Margaret laughed once, a tired laugh. That's the problem, Brian. You did know, maybe not consciously. But you knew enough to stay quiet. That's not fair. No, she said gently. What happened today wasn't fair. Brian rubbed his forehead. It's crowded upstairs, Mom. Vanessa was stressed. I paid for that dining room table. Silence, complete silence. Margaret continued calmly. I paid for the kitchen, I paid for those chairs, I paid for half this house. And tonight I ate downstairs alone like I was something embarrassing you needed hidden away. Brian opened his mouth, closed it again, because there was nothing to say. Truth creates silence like that sometimes. Vanessa burst into the laundry room moments later. What's going on? Margaret turned toward her. I'm moving out. Vanessa's face changed instantly. Not sadness, panic. What do you mean moving out? I mean exactly that. But where would you even go? The question landed badly, because underneath it was an assumption. That Margaret had nowhere else. No options, no independence. Margaret stood straighter than she had in months. I'm not helpless, Vanessa. Vanessa crossed her arms immediately. Nobody said you were. You treated me like I was. No, Vanessa snapped defensively. We welcomed you into our home. Margaret stared at her quietly, then said something Vanessa clearly never expected. No, she corrected softly. I paid to be here. That room went dead silent, because everyone knew it was true. Margaret packed that night. Not angrily, carefully, deliberately. She folded clothes neatly into suitcases, wrapped framed photographs in towels, packed Daniel's old watch separately. The girls cried when they realized she was leaving. That nearly broke her resolve. Nearly. But then Sophie asked an innocent question that sealed everything permanently. Grandma, she whispered tearfully, who's gonna cook now? Not who's gonna miss you. Who's gonna cook? Margaret smiled sadly, because children reveal truths adults try hiding. She drove away at midnight, alone, terrified, free. The road stretched dark and quiet ahead of her while Louisville disappeared slowly in the rearview mirror. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, Margaret felt something unfamiliar. Possibility. She rented a small townhouse 20 minutes away, nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, sunlight in the kitchen. A little patio for flowers. Peace. Real peace. Not the fragile kind dependent on everyone else's needs. The first morning there, Margaret drank coffee barefoot in silence and realized something astonishing. Loneliness and humiliation are not the same thing. She had confused them for years. Living alone wasn't the tragedy people made it out to be. Living unseen was. Brian called constantly at first. Guilt has a way of making people suddenly attentive. Mom, the girls miss you. Mom, Vanessa feels terrible. Mom, maybe we can work something out. Margaret listened calmly, then finally said what needed saying. I don't want arrangements anymore, Brian. I want respect. That sentence changed everything, because respect requires accountability, and accountability is much harder than apology. Weeks passed, then months. Margaret slowly rebuilt herself. She joined a book club, started volunteering at the library, took painting classes, made friends, real friends. People who asked her opinions instead of assigning her responsibilities. People who saw her as a person instead of a resource. One afternoon during watercolor class, another woman asked casually, "So what do you do for fun?" Margaret almost cried, because nobody had asked her that in years. Brian eventually visited alone. He sat awkwardly at her small kitchen table staring into his coffee. "You seem happier," he admitted quietly. Margaret smiled. "I am," Brian nodded slowly. Then tears filled his eyes unexpectedly. "I didn't realize how bad it got." Margaret believed him. That's the frightening thing about family dynamics. People adjust to dysfunction gradually until cruelty feels ordinary. Brian hadn't woken up intending to diminish his mother. He had simply benefited from her shrinking. And once people benefit from your silence, they rarely question it, until you stop being silent. "Vanessa thinks you hate her," Brian said softly. Margaret considered that carefully, then shook her head. No, I think Vanessa liked having someone beneath her. There's a difference. Brian flinched, because he knew, deep down he knew. The girls started visiting separately after that. Margaret taught Sophie how to bake pie crust from scratch, helped Ava with college essays. Slowly, relationships repaired themselves outside the environment that damaged them. That mattered, because toxic houses shape people. Sometimes the walls themselves become part of the problem. Almost a year later, Vanessa came to visit unexpectedly. Margaret nearly didn't answer the door, but she did. Vanessa stood there nervous and uncomfortable, holding a small orchid plant. I owe you an apology, she said immediately. Margaret stayed quiet. Vanessa swallowed hard. I think I got used to you always helping. And I stopped seeing how much you were giving. Margaret nodded once. That happens. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. The Easter thing was horrible. Yes, Margaret agreed calmly. It was. No dramatic forgiveness. No instant healing. Just honesty, real honesty. Sometimes that's more important. After Vanessa left, Margaret sat alone on her patio watching evening sunlight settle across the yard. And she thought about how easily women disappear inside families, especially older women, especially kind women, especially women taught their entire lives that love means self-sacrifice. People praise mothers and grandmothers endlessly for giving everything away, then act shocked when those women finally realize they deserve lives too. Margaret had spent years believing survival meant being needed. Now she understood something different. Being needed is not the same as being valued. And once you understand that distinction, you cannot unknow it. A few months later, Margaret hosted Thanksgiving in her townhouse. Small, simple, beautiful. Brian came. The girls came. Even Vanessa came quietly carrying homemade pie. And when dinner started, Sophie looked around the table and smiled. This feels nicer than last year. Margaret looked at the sunlight filling her tiny dining room, at the peacefulness, at the absence of tension, at her own hands no longer shaking from exhaustion or resentment. Then she smiled softly. Yes, she said. It really does. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret ate at the table she belonged at.